So welcome to One Hero a Day, where everyday courage lives on. Like and subscribe to hear a new story each night. The clouds had gathered quietly that afternoon, without ceremony. Not the fierce kind that rushed in with thunder, but the slow, gray weight that settled like a hand over the sea. In a small fishing village along the eastern coast of Samar Island, the tide lapped gently against the stilts of nipa huts. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children laughed somewhere in the trees, their voices skipping between bamboo fences and mangrove roots. Mang Rudi sat at the edge of the dock, eyes toward the horizon. He had always watched the sea this way, silently, without need for words. His hands, scarred and salt-worn, rested on his knees. He had fished these waters for over 4 decades, his skin as dark as driftwood, his breath slow and even. The sea had taken much from him, and in return, given him a kind of peace that only men like him understand. But today, the sea was speaking differently. The wind had shifted. A deep, steady current beneath the surface had changed course. Mang Rudi didn't need a weather report. He knew storms by the taste in the air. At his back, villagers moved about, fast now. Radios crackled warnings. Women pulled laundry from lines. There was a tension that hadn't been there that morning, when the sky was still generous. By nightfall, the local government would issue the signal. Super Typhoon Yolanda, known internationally as Haiyan, was coming. And it wasn't like the others. But Mang Rudi had known before they told him. Not just because of the sky, but because of the way the birds had gone silent. He rose slowly from the dock. The wooden planks creaked under his weight, not from age, but from familiarity. Everything around him felt like memory. His boat moored nearby, a small thing with patched sides and a faded blue stripe, the nets drying by his hut, the carved paddle leaning against the wall, tools of survival, of routine, of life held together by rope, faith, and time. Children ran past him, barefoot, calling to each other. A boy pointed to the west. Clouds were rolling in now, thicker, darker. Mang Rudi narrowed his eyes. It wasn't the wind that bothered him. It was the way the sea had gone quiet. Later that evening, as the sky deepened into a heavy bruise, he sat inside his small hut with a kerosene lamp flickering at his side. The radio, balanced on an upturned basin, hissed with static. A government voice came through, flat and distant. Storm surge warnings. Evacuation centers, code red. Most of the village was inland already. The mayor had ordered relocations hours ago, but not everyone had left. Mang Rudi knew that. There were always those who stayed too long, some by choice, many by circumstance. On the far edge of the coast, beyond the mangroves, 8 families lived in a low-lying cove. Fisherfolk like him, but poorer, if such a thing could be measured. No vehicles, no boats left, cut off already by swollen creeks and flooded paths. And now, the sea was rising. Mang Rudi stood again, not with the urgency of panic, but with the quiet finality of someone who had made up his mind. Outside, the rain began to fall. It tapped lightly against the thatched roof at first, like a whisper. But he knew what came next. In his heart, the storm had already begun. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by dawn, but it was the wind that told the real story. It didn't howl, not yet. It pressed. It leaned against the walls of homes, pulled at the corners of roofs, and whispered through the cracks like a warning looking for ears. Mang Rudi moved through it with slow, deliberate steps. He wasn't a tall man. Age had curled his shoulders forward, and etched deep lines into his face. But he carried something in him that made people step aside, not out of fear, but reverence. His presence was like a quiet tide. It didn't make noise, but you always knew when it was there. He walked to the shore where his boat was tethered. The sea had begun to churn, the usual green turning iron gray. Waves slapped the beach with impatience. In the distance, a coconut tree bent slightly more with each gust. Beside the boat lay the paddle, the same one he had carved with his father long ago, before the sea took his father in a storm not unlike this one. Mang Rudi reached down and lifted it, his fingers wrapped around the worn wood like a familiar hand. This was not a boat built for rescue. It was a fisherman's boat. Narrow, patched along the sides, the hull reinforced with whatever scraps could be spared over the years. It had never carried more than a few sacks of fish and a single man. No motor, no canopy, just a fisherman's hope and the sea's mercy. People had told him for years to retire it, buy something newer. But Mang Rudi didn't believe in throwing away what still had heart. And this boat, like him, still had heart. Back in the village, a group of neighbors watched him from behind a woven fence. One of the younger men, barely in his 20s, called out, "Manong Rudi, where are you going?" Mang Rudi didn't answer right away. He turned the paddle over in his hands. His eyes stayed on the sea. "They're still there," he said finally. "Those families near the cove, they haven't made it out." The young man stepped forward. "It's too dangerous. You can't. There's nothing you can do now. Even the Coast Guard." "I still have a boat," Mang Rudi said. That silenced them. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't defiance. It was just truth, spoken the way fishermen speak when there are no words left but the honest ones. Someone behind the fence muttered a quiet prayer. Mang Rudi stepped into the boat. The tide was already higher than usual. He tied down a plastic tarp, a small bundle of food wrapped in cloth, and a length of rope, just in case. He knelt for a moment, whispered something only the wind could hear, then stood and pushed off with a firm shove of the paddle. The boat shuddered slightly, then drifted forward. He didn't look back. Every part of his body knew this route: the mangroves, the shallows, the channels that curved between limestone outcrops. But today, everything was different. The water surged at strange angles, floating branches bumped the hull. A dead goat drifted by, eyes open, tangled in seaweed. Still, he paddled. His arms moved with the rhythm of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, but his breath was slower. He didn't fight the water. He moved with it, guiding the boat between pulses of current like a man dancing with an old partner. A dance he might not finish. Somewhere behind him, a thunderclap rolled across the sky. He passed a half-sunken banca, its bow pointed toward the sky like a question. It had been painted bright green once, but now it was cracked and rotting. He recognized it. It had belonged to a neighbor who'd moved to Manila last year. Mang Rudi offered a small nod as he passed. Memory was everywhere on this water. He thought of his wife, of how she used to wait for him at the edge of the dock, holding a towel and a shy smile. She'd been gone nearly 10 years now, taken by illness, not the sea. But sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still feel her hand in his. Ahead, a gust of wind slammed into the side of the boat. Mang Rudi braced with his paddle, shifting his weight just in time to keep from capsizing. Water splashed over the side. He bailed it out with a small bucket, breathing steadily. He whispered something under his breath again, Not a prayer, exactly. More like a promise. The clouds thickened. Rain blurred his vision. The land became a shadow behind him, the horizon a curtain of gray. But somewhere out there, 8 families waited. He didn't know if they had food, if their homes had held, if they'd already been swept away. But he had to find out. He pressed on. Each push of the paddle was heavier now, the water more defiant. But the boat held, and so did he. The wind came in bursts now, sharp, erratic, tugging at Mang Rudy's shirt and biting into his skin with cold teeth. But the rain had softened for a moment, and in that quiet lull, he could hear the sound of his own breath. Slow, intentional, like someone lighting a match in the dark and shielding it with both hands. He had passed the mangrove line, the last natural barrier before open water. The cove where the families lived was just beyond the limestone bend, half a mile, maybe less. Under normal skies, he could reach it in minutes. But this was no normal sky. Typhoon Yolanda had yet to make full landfall, but its limbs were already here, stretching far and wide, lashing coastlines, snapping trees like twigs. The worst was still to come, but the storm had started flexing its power. Mang Rudy wiped his face with the back of his hand. Salt and rain mixed on his skin. He gripped the paddle tighter. Every few strokes, he paused to listen, not to the storm, but for the absence of something. A kind of emptiness that signaled danger. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no crackle of insects. Just the relentless wash of water against water. Then, a sound. At first he wasn't sure, but then it came again. A thin cry, carried on the wind, barely above the crash of waves. It was the sound of someone calling. He turned the boat slightly, angling toward a stretch of shoreline that was mostly obscured by palm fronds and rock. As he approached, the cove slowly revealed itself like a secret unfolded. It was worse than he imagined. Floodwaters had consumed the narrow strip of land. Homes that once stood on stilts now sagged like broken knees, roofs half torn away, walls split open. Clotheslines dangled like vines, some still holding on to shirts that fluttered like surrender flags. A tin sheet flew past his boat, nearly striking him. Then he saw them. A small group of people, maybe 9 or 10, huddled on a raised patch of land, the last bit of elevation before everything dipped underwater. A man waved a piece of cloth frantically. 2 women clutched infants close to their chests. Children stood barefoot in mud, faces streaked with fear and rain. They saw the boat. One of the boys cried out, "Si Mang Rudy!" Relief broke across the group like a breeze through smoke. He steered hard toward them, maneuvering the boat through floating debris. A fallen tree blocked part of the path, and he had to dismount into the waist-deep water to pull the boat around it. Teeth gritted as the current tried to wrest the boat from his grip. When he reached the families, he didn't speak right away. He looked into their faces. He saw a woman whose lips were blue from cold, a boy with a gash above his eyebrow, an old man holding a battered rooster in a woven cage. One by one, they helped each other into the boat. He had space for 5. He took 9. The boat sagged, dangerously low in the water. Someone said they should wait for a second trip. Mang Rudy shook his head. No time. The sky growled in the distance. A young girl, no more than 6, stared at him with wide eyes as he gripped the paddle again. "Will we make it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mang Rudy didn't promise. He never promised what he couldn't control, but he nodded slowly and said, "Hold on." They did. He pushed off, muscles burning with the strain of the overloaded boat. The water was higher now. The current fought him at every angle like something alive and angry. Branches scraped the sides. A sudden gust nearly knocked 2 passengers overboard. He shouted, not in fear, but to keep them together. "Keep low! Stay down!" The boat rocked, creaked, threatened to splinter, but it didn't. Mang Rudi rowed like a man possessed, not by madness, but by memory. He remembered what it felt like to lose someone and not be able to do anything. He remembered how the sea took his brother one afternoon and gave back only his slippers. He wasn't going to let that happen today. Not while he still had hands. Not while the boat still held. Behind them, the shoreline vanished into gray. The little girl gripped the side. Her eyes locked on him. She didn't cry. She just watched. He paddled until his arms screamed, until his shoulders locked. Still, he didn't stop. It was the old man with the rooster who finally spoke. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice rasping. Mang Rudi didn't look at him. He kept paddling. "Because I could," he said. Ahead, the first hint of the village came into view. Just the shape of a roof, barely visible through the mist and rain. Mang Rudi exhaled. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath. They were almost back, almost. The boat scraped the shoreline like a breath returning to lungs. It wasn't the proper dock. That had already disappeared under the rising water. But it was close enough. A patch of mud and grass near the old belait tree, just shy of where the village proper began. The moment the hull hit ground, Mang Rudi stood to steady the vessel. "Slowly," he said, voice hoarse from salt and wind. One by one. The children were the first to climb off, their feet sinking into wet earth. A mother handed off her baby and followed. The old man, still clutching his rooster, needed help. Mang Rudi offered his arm without a word. They moved like a single body, lifting, guiding, holding. When the last of the passengers stepped off, Mang Rudi didn't join them. He turned, looked back toward the water. He wasn't done. A few villagers had gathered nearby, faces strained with disbelief. One woman crossed herself. Another man offered a blanket, but Mang Rudi waved it off. "How many still there?" someone asked. "More," he said simply. A boy, maybe 13, stepped forward. "Let me come with you, Mang Rudi. I can help row." Mang Rudi shook his head. "Boat's too small, too heavy already. But it's dangerous." "I know." That was all. He reached into a side pocket of the boat and took out the soaked bundle of food. It had stayed mostly dry under the tarp. He handed it to a woman holding the baby. "For the little one," he murmured. Then he pushed the boat back into the water. The crowd watched as he waded into the surf again, chest deep now, legs braced against the push of water. He climbed in slowly, grunted as the wind pulled at him, then seated himself and lifted the paddle once more. There was no applause, no fanfare, just quiet and rain. He rowed back into the gray like a man returning to finish a promise. The second trip was worse. The wind had strengthened in the past hour, gusting in short, violent punches. The tide was no longer rising. It was surging like an animal let loose. Debris filled the channel now. Logs, branches, shattered crates. At one point, a sheet of corrugated metal drifted past, jagged and gleaming like a blade. Mang Rudi kept his eyes low, his strokes tighter. He didn't pray, not aloud, but his lips moved with each breath, small words only he could hear. Not for himself, for them, the ones still waiting. He hoped they were still waiting. When he neared the cove again, it was unrecognizable. The shoreline had vanished entirely. The last patch of land where he'd found the families was gone, submerged under angry brown water. Only the top of a nipa hut peeked above the waves like a dying breath. He scanned the area, heart thudding. Then, movement. A man standing waist-deep in water, waving both arms. Others behind him, clustered together, partially hidden by what was left of a fence line. Two women had climbed onto a wooden table now floating like a raft. A teenage boy was holding a toddler on his shoulders, shifting his feet to stay balanced. They were still here. Mang Rudy shouted, "I'll come around!" The current was too strong for a straight approach, so he angled the boat in a curve, letting the tide push him sideways. He fought to keep the boat steady. Every correction of the paddle felt like lifting stone. His wrists ached. His breath rasped. Finally, he reached them. This group was smaller, 7 people, 2 of them children. No one hesitated. They clambered aboard, soaked to the bone, teeth chattering. One man carried nothing but a plastic bag wrapped tight. Everything he owned now, Mang Rudy guessed. The boat dipped again. It groaned under the weight. Too much. Mang Rudy scanned the faces. He did a quick count. Then he stepped out of the boat. They stared at him. "No," one of the women said, shaking her head. "You need someone to guide it back," he replied. "But I'll come after." There was no time for argument. He pushed the boat gently, guided it into the current's grasp. Then he released it and stood in chest-deep water, watching as it drifted away, carrying his passengers back toward the village. He was alone now, but he wasn't afraid. He found a piece of floating wood, part of someone's door frame, and used it to steady himself. The water tugged and twisted, 1,000 fingers trying to pull him under. He focused on breathing, one breath, then another. He would wait here. If the boat held, if the villagers understood, someone would bring it back. If not, he would try to swim. Either way, he wasn't done. Not yet. The storm had teeth now. From where he waited, Mang Rudy could see the sky folding in on itself, darker than before, not just cloud, but weight. A smothering kind of darkness. The kind that presses against your bones and doesn't ask permission. He gripped the doorframe tighter. It floated just enough to keep him from slipping beneath the surface, but every wave slapped it loose, forced him to hold tighter. His legs were beginning to cramp. The salt water stung the gash on his shin from earlier, a scrape he hadn't noticed when he was pulling the boat around debris. His heart beat slowly, deliberately. Not from calm, but from control. He had trained himself to stay steady in chaos. As a fisherman, you had to. The sea didn't care how strong you were. It only respected patience and resolve. Time passed. He didn't know how much. Minutes, perhaps. Long enough for the numbness to crawl up from his toes to his knees. He clenched his jaw and looked to the horizon. Then, a shape. Low and dark, bobbing unevenly against the waves. The boat. They had sent it back. A man stood in it, paddle in hand, fighting the current with frantic energy. Mang Rudy didn't recognize him. Maybe someone younger from the village, one of the sons of the families he had ferried across. Whoever he was, his eyes were fixed ahead, and his face, even from a distance, held something fierce. Hope can look like that sometimes. Fierce. The boat neared, and Mang Rudy raised one hand weakly. The man saw him, nodded, paddled harder. Soon, the bow of the boat nudged the edge of the floating door. Mang Rudy let go and grabbed the side, pulling himself in with effort that made his entire body shake. He collapsed onto the wooden plank, water pouring from his clothes, breath shallow. "You all right, Mang Rudy?" He opened one eye. The voice was young, trembling slightly. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. "I'm here," Rudy said. That was enough. They didn't speak much as they turned back toward the village. The wind howled above them, tearing at their clothes, flinging needles of rain into their eyes. But they made progress, slow, crawling, but forward. And then, just before the bend in the coast, they saw something strange. Smoke. Not the rising black kind from fire, but steam, white and fleeting, like breath in cold air. It took Mang Rudy a moment to understand. Someone had lit a cooking fire. It was a signal. A woman stood near it, waving a shawl from under a coconut tree. Mang Rudy squinted. A new group. Not the families he had rescued. Others. Maybe ones who had been trapped inland, now forced to the shore by the rising waters. He turned to the boy. "Drop me off, then take them." The boy hesitated. "Go," Rudy insisted. They neared the bank again, and Mang Rudy jumped before the boat fully stopped, landing in knee-deep mud. The ground sloshed and held him fast for a second. He stumbled forward. His joints screamed. He turned and gave the boy a nod. "Careful," he said. The boy didn't answer, just saluted, paddled off toward the waving woman. Mang Rudy stood there, alone again. The rain had lightened for just a moment, just long enough to see the full shape of the village now. Half of it was gone. Roofs lay like fallen leaves across flooded fields. Walls leaned at strange angles. The community center, once the tallest structure in the area, now had its second floor shredded open to the sky. Smoke from makeshift fires curled into the air in thin, defiant ribbons. But people were moving, helping each other, pulling belongings from water, stacking wood, boiling rice over broken stoves. And through the noise, someone spotted him. "Mang Rudy!" A small voice cutting through the wind, then another, then many. He turned to see a group of children running toward him, ankle-deep in water, their arms outstretched like they were greeting someone returned from war. They wrapped around his legs, tugged at his sleeves, touched his hands as if to make sure he was real. "You came back," one girl said. He smiled weakly. Still more to do. From behind them, an elder woman stepped forward. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed red. "Rudy," she said, "you saved my daughter." She placed something in his hands, a rosary, dark with age, the beads worn smooth. "For strength," she said softly. He nodded, closed his fingers around it. Just then, a new sound. Frantic footsteps splashing through water. It was the boy, back with the boat. "Another group," he shouted, breathless. "Trapped near the old school, the water's rising fast." Mang Rudy looked at him, then at the rosary in his hand. He didn't hesitate. "Let's go," he said. They turned back toward the water, toward the storm that refused to tire. But neither did they. The old school was never meant to be a refuge. It stood at the edge of Barangay Luntad, where the forest began to overtake the farmland, a simple two-room structure built from hollow blocks and tin. Mang Rudy remembered painting it once, years ago, when the village still held cleanup drives on weekends. Back then, children's laughter filled its narrow hallways. Today, it was a prayer clinging to collapsing walls. As the boat creaked along the path, he and the boy carved through wind and water. Mang Rudy kept his eyes locked on the horizon. He knew the area well, the way the land dipped just before the ridge, the bend in the river that looped past the acacia tree. But nothing looked the same now. Floodwater covered the rice paddies in a murky sheet. The stalks bent beneath the weight of the storm. Floating coconuts, shards of bamboo, and strips of tin roof bobbed around them like lost fragments of another world. The boy, whose name Rudy still didn't know, paddled hard. "There," Rudy said, pointing. "That break in the tree line. Go right." The boy followed without question. Minutes later, they saw it. The schoolhouse, half submerged. Water reached the windows. One side of the roof had been torn off entirely. On the second floor, several people stood pressed against the far wall. Others had climbed to the exposed rafters. A woman was waving a shirt like a flag. Children huddled at her feet. The boat groaned as they approached, nearly capsizing as the current whipped around the broken foundation. Mang Rudy shouted over the wind, "We can't take all of you at once." A man on the roof nodded. "Take the children first." Mang Rudy reached out his arms, helped one child after another into the boat. A girl, no older than 6, cried silently as he lifted her. She clutched a soaked plastic doll, its eyes painted wide in permanent surprise. The boy adjusted their weight carefully. "That's 6, he murmured. Rudy looked back at the school. 4 more, that's the limit." They nodded, no one complaining, no one pushing forward. One woman tried to hand him her baby, but he gestured gently. "Next trip," he promised. When they turned the boat around, Mang Rudy saw something that gave him pause. Behind the schoolhouse, where the slope met the gully, the earth was giving way. A landslide, slow but unmistakable. Mud pulling trees from the roots, soil sagging, cracking like broken skin. They had minutes, maybe. "Paddle hard," Rudy said, and the boy understood. The journey back was brutal. The boat was heavy with children and fear. The waves slapped harder now, and the rain returned in sheets, slicing sideways across their faces. Mang Rudy kept one arm braced over the children, shielding them. He had no coat, only a thin cotton shirt, but his body blocked the wind well enough. One child threw up quietly into the side of the boat. Another closed her eyes and whispered something, a lullaby maybe, or a prayer. Rudy didn't speak. His jaw was set. When they finally reached the bank, people rushed forward. Arms lifted the children from the boat. Blankets wrapped around shoulders. Hot soup, somehow still steaming, was passed around. But Mang Rudy turned immediately to the boy. Again. The boy blinked. His hands were blistered. "We'll flip if we take more. We take only the strongest this time. They can help row. Then we'll go faster," the boy said. They launched the boat once more. By now, others were watching from what was left of the high ground. An old man with a flashlight stood atop a jeepney, signaling with long, slow beams. The village was working as one now, a kind of quiet coordination born not from orders, but from shared desperation. At the school, the water had climbed another foot. The man from the roof waved urgently. "Hurry!" he called. "The back wall is cracking." Mang Rudy scanned the group, picking 3 young men and the woman with the baby. "Let's go," he said. The men jumped in, grabbing paddles from the floor. The woman cradled her child against her chest, lips pressed to its forehead. As they pulled away, the groaning sound behind them turned into a deep rumble. The rear corner of the school collapsed. It happened slowly at first, like something exhausted letting go. Then came the rush, water pouring through the opening, snapping support beams like twigs. Screams erupted from the rafters, but the boat was already moving, faster this time. The 3 new paddlers worked with urgent, synchronized strokes. The boy focused on steering. Mang Rudy sat near the woman, one hand on the side of the boat, steadying the weight. They reached the village edge just as the wind shifted direction. A signal. The eye of the storm was passing. Everything paused. A strange hush, as though the world had taken a breath. That silence. It wasn't peace. It was the quiet between verses of a terrible song. Mang Rudy looked skyward. More rain would come, more wind, maybe worse than before. They had time for one last trip. Maybe. He turned to the boy. Ready? But this time, the boy didn't answer right away. His hands trembled. His breath was shallow. He looked down, ashamed. I can't. Mang Rudy placed a hand on his shoulder. You did well. Rest now. Then he turned to the crowd. His voice didn't need to be loud. One more. A man stepped forward, tall and sturdy, a tricycle driver. Rudy had seen him once fixing a tire in the heat of day. I'll go, the man said. Together they pushed the boat back toward the dying schoolhouse, toward the last few waiting, toward the end of the storm's breath. The third trip was the quietest, not because the storm had passed. No, it hadn't. The second wall of wind was still waiting just beyond the ridge, gathering strength like a clenched fist. But for a brief stretch of minutes, the sea stilled. The sky lightened slightly. The wind, though still present, moved differently, like it was remembering how to be gentle. It was the eye, the center of the typhoon, that eerie moment when destruction pauses to draw breath. The tricycle driver paddled in practiced strokes. Mang Rudy sat opposite him, eyes fixed ahead. Neither spoke. Words would only get in the way now. As they approached the school again, the building looked different, half gone now, sagging into the flood like a dying creature. Of the two classrooms, one was reduced to 3 walls and a tilted roof. The remaining survivors clung to what remained. 6 of them, drenched, pale, eyes wide with waiting. Mang Rudy raised a hand. A woman waved back. Another, a teenager, maybe 17, clutched a younger boy, her arms locked around him. He looked unconscious, or asleep. It was hard to tell from the distance. Steady, Rudy murmured. The boat scraped against the side of the collapsing foundation. Mang Rudy reached up, helped the woman down first, then the teenager, gently handing the younger boy into Rudy's arms. He was breathing, shallow but steady. A bump on his head explained the stillness. The last 3 came quickly. One man limped badly. His leg had been struck by flying debris. The tricycle driver helped him in, then turned to paddle again. But just as they began to push away, a new sound tore through the air. Crack. Not from the building, from the hillside above. Mang Rudy turned in time to see the slope split, a fracture opening through the muddy ground, pulling roots and trees down like coins slipping into a pocket. It was the other side of the landslide, the heavy part. Go! Rudy shouted, and the paddles hit the water with everything they had. The surge came like a monster, not water this time, but earth. A churning wave of mud and fallen trees, rushing toward the riverbank, then into the schoolyard, pushing water ahead of it in a violent burst. The boat lifted, swayed, nearly tipped, but it held. Behind them, the school gave one final groan and then collapsed entirely, swallowed by the mud and the rising tide. No one spoke. The paddling didn't stop until the village came into view again, rising slowly from behind the flooded palms. This time, when they landed, it wasn't just rescue. It was survival. The people waiting didn't cheer. They didn't cry out. They simply reached for the ones they loved and held them, silently. Sometimes, the quiet says more than the noise ever could. The teenager clung to her brother as if trying to warm him with her heart. The man with the limp was carried by two others to a dry mat. Someone passed Mang Rudy a can of sardines and a cup of boiled water. He accepted them, but didn't eat. He was still watching the horizon, waiting for the wind to return, and it did. Gradually, like fingers tightening their grip. The sky dimmed again. The trees swayed harder. The lull was over. "Mang Rudy," someone called. It was the barangay captain, a wiry man with a deep voice and calloused hands. He had been organizing the village's shelter spaces, arranging blankets, rationing rice. "There's word," he said. "Some families took shelter in the old chapel, near the mangrove path." Mang Rudy didn't need to ask. He knew the place. It was farther inland, a low-lying trail surrounded by dense trees and tangled roots, where the river met the sea. The chapel sat on stilts, raised but vulnerable. "How many?" Rudy asked. "Maybe a dozen people, children, elders, we're not sure." Rudy looked down at his hands, swollen, blistered, bleeding at the knuckles. He looked at the boat, still afloat. The tricycle driver was already checking the ropes. "I'll go again," the man said. Rudy gave him a look of gratitude. Before they left, the captain handed Rudy a waterproof flashlight. "You'll need it. Light's going fast." He took it, nodded, then stepped into the boat once more. They pushed off in silence. The water was colder now, the wind sharper, but their hands were steady. Through the flooded fields and the twisted remains of fences, they moved. Two men, one mission. Mang Rudy gripped the sides of the boat, guiding the path from memory. The mangrove trail wasn't meant for boats. It was narrow, tangled. But in this storm, the rules had changed. Trees leaned close. The water rippled with floating leaves. Somewhere distant, a branch cracked. Birds, those that hadn't flown ahead of the storm, rustled in panic above. Finally, the chapel came into view, perched above the water like a stubborn relic. A candle burned in one window. Rudy blinked. It was real. They paddled closer. Then a voice. "Help!" A boy, maybe 10 years old. His face appeared through the wooden slats. More voices followed. A woman sobbing, an elder man calling for quiet. Rudy felt the water shift beneath them. The tide was rising fast now. The mangroves weren't holding it back anymore. He stood, steadying himself. "We're here," he said. And the chapel, like a wounded ship, leaned a little closer to the sea. Inside the chapel, it smelled of damp wood and old prayers. The wind had pried open one of the shutters, and rain leaked through a crack in the ceiling, falling in quiet, steady drops onto the stone floor. A wooden cross still hung above the altar, tilted slightly to the left. Below it, huddled together like petals around a flame, were 13 souls, mostly women and children. One elderly man with shaking hands, a young mother with a baby wrapped in cloth. They had waited. They had believed someone would come. And when they saw Mang Rudy standing at the edge of the chapel, flashlight held high, something shifted in the room, not in volume, but in air. A collective exhale, like fear finally loosening its grip. "Come," he said gently. "We have to go now." The old man tried to rise and nearly fell. Mang Rudy crossed the water-slick floor in 2 strides and caught him beneath the arm. The tricycle driver stayed by the boat, keeping it steady against the drifting tide. The water around the chapel was rising. It now lapped at the bottom step. If they waited much longer, the boat might not reach them again. They moved quickly but carefully. The baby was passed first, sleeping, or perhaps too tired to cry. Then the children, one by one. A teenage girl carried a bag of medicine against her chest. "For Lolo," she whispered. He has a weak heart." Rudy nodded. The boat was almost full. Just 3 more left. That's when the wind returned in full. It came not as a gust, but a wall, a sudden slap of force that bent the mangrove trees, turned rain into needles. The boat rocked wildly, nearly losing balance. "Hold on," the driver called out, bracing himself. The final woman stepped out onto the chapel's edge, her foot hesitating at the threshold of water. The chapel groaned. Not the boat, the building. It was sinking. The ground beneath the stilts had softened, giving way to the storm's relentless push. The whole structure shifted, slanting toward the flood. Rudy's eyes met hers. He reached out his hand. "Jump," he said. She did. He caught her, barely. Her foot scraped against the hull, and she nearly went over. But the driver pulled her back just in time. The chapel leaned further. Then, with a slow, reluctant creak, it fell, not collapsed, not shattered, just bowed like it had knelt in surrender. The wooden cross slipped from the wall and vanished beneath the rising dark. They were already paddling hard, the rain slicing sideways, the water choking with twigs, leaves, and shattered branches. But they were moving, fast enough to escape the chapel's pull. Mang Rudy didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat ached from the wind, and every muscle screamed from exertion. The tricycle driver's eyes were squinted slits against the rain, but his arms never stopped moving. The boat cut through the mangrove trail like a heartbeat, sharp and urgent. "Almost there," someone whispered from the back. "Almost there." But then, the boat struck something. A root, submerged and sharp. It jolted hard to one side. Someone screamed. Water rushed in through the crack near the bow. For a moment, they all froze. Then Mang Rudy moved, grabbing his bucket, bailing instinctively, ordering the children to stay still, balancing weight. The tricycle driver steered hard to the left, away from the root network, into clearer water. The boat dipped, tilted, then leveled. The crack held, barely. It wasn't far now. Just half a kilometer to the high ground. They could see the faint shimmer of lanterns through the trees. A few people stood in the rain, waving tarpaulins, shouting their names. The boat crept forward, slow but steady. When they finally reached the edge of the village, hands reached out, lifting passengers with the urgency of love. Mothers pulled children to their chests. The old man was carried inside on a makeshift stretcher. The medicine girl handed her bag to the village nurse, who opened it with trembling fingers. "You made it," someone said. Mang Rudy sat down slowly on the muddy ground. He didn't respond. His eyes were closed, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The tricycle driver handed him a tin cup of warm ginger water. "Drink." He did, and in that small act, his hands began to shake. Not from cold, from release. The weight of hours, of paddling against a storm, of pulling strangers from roofs and broken buildings. It crashed through him now, in silence. He hadn't counted how many lives they'd pulled from the water. 13 at the chapel, 9 at the school, 10 in the first house, 8 in the second, 40, maybe more. All while the storm tried to break everything. Someone lit a small fire nearby, not large, just enough to warm a circle. The villagers gathered close. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. The boy, the one from the first rescue, found Rudy and sat beside him again. "I watched," he said. "All of it." Rudy turned. "You did more than watch." The boy nodded. then looked at the boat, resting now in the mud, cracked, splintered at the edge. She won't last another trip. No, Rudy agreed. Then he looked up at the sky. The second wall of wind was nearly overhead. Trees shivered in anticipation. The air grew heavy again. But the people, the ones they'd saved, were all here now, together. They had made it through the worst. For a moment, Mang Rudy allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the hardest part was over. Then came the scream. From the far edge of the village, someone was still missing. The scream came again, high, sharp, breaking through the rain like glass. A mother's voice, ragged and raw. Mang Rudy stood up before he knew he was standing. The cup fell from his hand. He moved toward the sound, legs aching, feet dragging slightly in the mud, but moving nonetheless. The tricycle driver followed. They found her near the broken fence line, a young woman soaked through, eyes wild. She was calling a name over and over. Marielle! Marielle, please! Two neighbors were trying to steady her, but she kept slipping from their grasp, pointing toward the distant creek bed. She went to look for our dog. She said he was scared. I told her not to go. I told her. How long ago? Mang Rudy asked gently. The woman turned to him, as if only now recognizing he was real. 15 minutes, maybe more. Rudy looked toward the creek. It cut through the far end of the village, usually shallow, barely ankle deep. But in a storm like this, it could rise without warning, turn into a rushing vein of death. He didn't wait. Flashlight, he said. The driver handed him one without question. And rope. Someone passed a coil, already wet and muddy. He didn't take the boat. There was no time, and the path to the creek was too narrow, too cluttered. This was a job for feet, not paddles. As he started running, a few others joined him. 2 teenage boys, the village nurse's brother, and the tricycle driver again, trailing just behind. The rain was heavier now, the kind that slaps your back and makes your clothes feel like stone. The wind ripped at the trees, sent banana leaves flying like torn paper. Every step was a fight. They reached the creek. It was no longer a quiet trickle. It roared, thick, brown, churning water racing beneath the old wooden footbridge. The bridge itself was leaning hard to one side. One rope support snapped. But that wasn't where Rudy was looking. He scanned the banks. Marielle! He shouted. The others echoed him. Marielle! No answer. Then, movement. A small figure clinging to the base of a fallen tree at the far edge of the creek, half submerged, shivering. She was maybe 8 or 9, Marielle. Rudy's chest tightened. She wasn't crying. She looked too tired even for that. Her eyes were barely open, her hands clenched in bark and hope. The rope came off Rudy's shoulder in one smooth motion. He tied it around his waist, passed the other end to the driver. Anchor me. Rudy, it's too deep. I don't need to cross. Just reach. He stepped into the current. The water was ice moving like muscle. It tried to take his legs right away, pulling at his knees, tugging at his balance. He pressed forward, step by step. The rope jerked as it caught tension. Behind him, the men held it firm. Marielle, he called again. I'm coming. She didn't respond. Her eyes were closed now. The tree shifted slightly in the current. Another step. Another. Then, suddenly, a surge. A wave of water from upstream crashed around him, pushing him hard to the side. The rope burned against his waist. His feet slipped, but he didn't fall. He reached the tree. His hand found her arm. Cold, small. She didn't flinch. He pulled her close, wrapping his body around hers, shielding her from the force of the creek. "She's breathing!" he shouted. Then, "Pull!" The men on the bank began to heave. The rope strained, slipping through mud, dragging them back inch by inch. Rudy held tight. His foot struck a rock, slipped, regained. The current fought them all the way, but slowly, achingly, they inched backward, until finally they were clear. Rudy collapsed onto the bank with the girl in his arms. Mud caked his face. His shoulder throbbed. She blinked, just once, then buried her face in his chest. The mother arrived moments later, running like something was chasing her grief. When she saw her daughter, she fell to her knees, not crying, just breathing, in heavy, grateful sobs. Later, someone would say the creek rose another foot within the hour, that if they'd waited even 5 minutes more, the girl would have been lost. But Rudy didn't think about that. He just sat with her, one hand still wrapped around the rope, the other gently cradling her small shoulder. The wind howled again, rattling the treetops. A new burst of rain came down, hard and fast. Night had fallen completely now, but the fire back in the village still burned, and they would go back to it. Rudy stood again, slowly, as if testing whether his body would agree to more. It did. Barely. He turned to the driver. "We'll need to fix the boat." The man looked at him. "Tonight?" Rudy didn't answer right away. Then, "There might still be someone out there." The man nodded. He understood. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the trees and the flood and the fear, the storm prepared its final blow. The village slept in pieces, some under tarps, some on church pews, some in the schoolhouse, huddled close beneath salvaged blankets and plastic sheeting. Sleep, if it came at all, was thin, a half-conscious doze between thunderclaps, the kind of rest born not from comfort, but from sheer exhaustion. But Mang Rudy did not sleep. Not yet. He stood beside his wooden boat, which now rested crookedly in the mud, its hull damaged but not destroyed. The bow was cracked. A thin line ran along the bottom seam where the root had struck it. Not a hole, but a wound. One more trip, maybe two, and it would give way. He ran his hand along the wood as if checking a heartbeat. The tricycle driver arrived a few minutes later, carrying a bundle wrapped in a rice sack. Inside, tools, twine, some nails, a hammer dulled from rust, and a small tin of boat glue. "It's not much," he said, setting it down, "but it might hold her together." Rudy gave a tired smile. "We'll make it enough." They worked quietly, by lantern light. The glow flickered in the rain, and their fingers were stiff, but the boat was like a living thing to them, and they knew its language. They stitched bamboo fibers along the seam first, then spread a paste of tree sap and glue into the crack. Over that, a strip of rubber pulled from an old tire tube. The hammer taps were slow and careful. 1, 2, then 3, breath, then again. The wind made the trees hiss, but they barely noticed. Their minds were inside the work, inside the shape of wood and water and what it meant to mend. Behind them, the village stirred now and then. A baby cried. A cough echoed. Someone sang a lullaby, too soft to catch all the words. The fire still burned low, sheltered under an iron pot. Smoke curled like a thread toward the black sky. When they finished, it was nearly midnight. Rudy sat back, arms resting on his knees. The boat looked tired, but ready, like him. "You sure it'll hold?" the driver asked. "No," Rudy answered softly, "but we don't have a choice." He stood again, brushing the mud from his pants. One last sweep. They didn't need to search far. From the edge of the village, a teenager came running. His shirt clung to his chest, and he was gasping for air. "There's a house," he cried. "Back by the old coconut grove. The bridge washed out. No way across. My little brother's there, with my Lola." "How far?" "About a kilometer, but the field's flooded. No path." Rudy looked at the boat. He didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The boy climbed in first, clutching a small flashlight with dying batteries. Rudy took the paddle this time. The tricycle driver sat behind, eyes alert. The water had crept higher. The trail that once led through mangroves was now a wide, dark river. The moon was a smudge behind thick clouds. All that guided them was instinct and memory. The trees were quieter now, bent in submission. The storm was still overhead, but it had become less violent, more deliberate. Like a beast pacing, not attacking. They passed a bloated goat floating belly up, then an overturned cart, then silence again. "Is it close?" Rudy asked. The boy pointed. "Beyond those trees," he nodded. The field appeared. What used to be a patchwork of grass and coconut palms was now a lake. Water rippled across what should have been dirt. Only the tips of banana trunks were visible. In the distance, on a rise barely above the flood, a house leaned. Light flickered inside. "They're still there," the boy said. The current was slower here but wide. The boat drifted sideways, listing slightly. Rudy paddled hard on the right, correcting its path. The patch job groaned beneath his feet, but held. As they reached the house, they saw an old woman at the doorway, ankle-deep in water, holding a child by the arm. Her gray hair was soaked, but her eyes were clear. When she saw her grandson, her lips moved in a prayer. "Lola!" the boy called out. He was out of the boat before it stopped. She cradled his face. "I told you not to come. I brought help." She turned to Rudy, and just for a second her face changed, not in fear or surprise, but in recognition, as if she had known he would come, just not how. The child was silent, pale. The boy scooped him up. "He has a fever?" Rudy reached for them. "Quickly!" The old woman hesitated. "The roof's leaking," she said. "But it's our home." Rudy met her gaze. "It's still yours, but you need to live to return to it." She nodded. They loaded the child first, then the old woman. The boy climbed back in last. The return was slower. The water was thicker somehow, heavy with unseen debris. Rudy's arms burned. Halfway across, they struck something again. Not hard, a graze just enough to tilt the boat slightly. Water seeped in. Rudy bailed it out with a cup. They reached the edge of the village just before the wind returned. Not with fury, but finality, like a door closing. The boat, cracked and tired, sighed beneath them. As they stepped off, Rudy turned back. She had done it. One last trip. And then she listed slightly and sank half an inch into the mud. No more. The old woman leaned close and whispered, "You've done more than enough, hijo." Rudy only nodded, but even as the others moved toward shelter, he stood beside the boat for a long while, one hand on her edge, thanking her and listening, not to the storm, but to the silence that came after. The sky began to pale, not with sunlight, not yet, but with that gray softening that comes just before dawn, when the storm has worn itself out and the world waits to see what remains. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The wind moved in fits, no longer a howl, but a sigh. Somewhere above, the typhoon had passed. What it left behind was mud, broken fences, and silence. And inside that silence, breath. Life, bruised but breathing. Mang Rudy sat on the church steps, drenched to the bone, body shaking not from fear, but from cold and sheer depletion. His hands, raw from rope burns, rested on his knees. Beside him, the tricycle driver leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, mouth open slightly. Not asleep, but hovering near it. The fire had died down. The school's windows flickered with lantern light. Somewhere, a rooster crowed, faint, unsure. And then, a laugh. A child's, small and sudden. It came from the makeshift shelter where several rescued families had gathered. Inside, a toddler was splashing his feet in a bucket of rainwater, giggling each time the droplets hit his mother's leg. She laughed too, one hand on his back, the other wiping mud from his brow. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Rudy looked up. Across the courtyard, people were beginning to move. Some poked their heads from doorways. Others stepped out fully, blinking against the new light, as if testing whether the danger was truly gone. A man climbed onto a roof, calling out names. A woman lit a stove to boil rice. Life, like the river, finds a way. Rudy rose slowly. Every muscle resisted, but he walked anyway, across the courtyard, past the leaning boat, past the charred fire pit, to the edge of the village where a group was gathering. There, beneath a bent mango tree, stood the mayor, a young man, barely 30, face tight with fatigue. He was barefoot, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. Rudy nodded a greeting. The mayor nodded back. "You're Mang Rudy?" "Yes." "I've heard what you did." Rudy shook his head. "I just paddled." "Number you brought them back." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a team of teenagers hauled down broken tarps and repurposed them into bedding. One of the school teachers was counting heads, marking names. The mayor looked down at his clipboard. 26 people. You brought back 26 people." Rudy didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the boat. "She won't float again," he said, almost to himself. "We'll build you another," the mayor replied. Rudy looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "Maybe, but it won't be her." The mayor smiled, a small curl at the edge of his mouth. "I understand." Then his face turned serious. "There's word from the other barangay across the ridge. The road's blocked. Landslide, they think. They haven't heard from their northern zone." Rudy waited. "We're sending a team by foot, but it'll take hours, maybe more." "I'm not a young man," Rudy said, almost gently. The mayor's eyes softened. "But you know the land." Rudy looked out across the muddy horizon. In the far distance, the river shimmered under a sky now streaked with lavender. "I'll go," he said. A pause. The mayor didn't argue. "We'll prepare food, water, a walking stick." Rudy shook his head. "Just water? I'll find the rest." He turned, then hesitated. "The boy, the one from the coconut grove, he should come. He knows the trails." The mayor nodded. "We'll ask him." And with that, Rudy walked back toward the boat, not to sail her again, but to gather the last of his things. A satchel, a scarf, the rope coiled tight. He took one moment longer at her side, ran his palm along her edge. "Rest now," he whispered. Then he stood and walked forward, toward the rising light, toward another village, toward more lives not yet accounted for. Behind him, the village began to stir in full, sweeping, hammering, cooking, counting, calling out names. The night had ended, but his journey, it seemed, had one more bend. The mud sucked at his feet. Each step was a negotiation between gravity, exhaustion, and the uneven ground left behind by the flood. Mang Rudy walked slowly, deliberately, his breath steady. At his side, the boy from the grove moved more lightly, youth lending speed even to weariness. They carried little, A jug of water, a cloth bundle of rice and salt, a rope, nothing more. The sky overhead was a sheet of pale gray, the color of damp ash. Trees stood like mourners, stripped, leaning, silent. Birds were absent. The usual morning calls that once filled these trails had been replaced by stillness. The path they took was not a proper road. It was a memory of one. Bamboo stalks bent low where the weight of the storm had broken them. Fallen branches littered the way. Rudy's feet slid often, his toes seeking purchase on the slick clay. The boy moved ahead, sometimes doubling back to clear a branch or point out a firmer step. They spoke little, but in that silence, something deeper grew. A trust born not of words, but of shared purpose. An hour passed, then two. The trees grew denser as they climbed the ridge. The boy stopped, pointing toward a patch of land where the trail abruptly disappeared. "This used to be the shortcut," he said. "Now it's gone." Rudy studied it. What had been a dirt track was now a slide of rock and sludge. The earth had collapsed, trees and all. He peered down into the broken land. No way through. "We'll go around," he said. They turned left, cutting through brush. The slope steepened. Rudy grunted, catching himself on a trunk. The boy offered a hand. Rudy refused it with a small nod. Not pride, just rhythm. He needed to do this at his own pace. Above them, clouds shifted. A single ray of sunlight broke through, pale and diffused, but enough to cast shadows again. By midday, they reached the top of the ridge. Below, the valley, or what was left of it. From here, the view should have shown rice fields stretching like green silk. But now, it was water. Brown, unmoving water, with bits of rooftop and treetops poking through. The boy inhaled sharply. "That's San Mateo." Rudy squinted. In the far distance, smoke rose from a small hut, black and straight. Not fire, not destruction. Cooking smoke. Life. "There," he said. They began the descent. It was harder. The mud was deeper on this side. The boy lost a slipper. Rudy stumbled twice, his hands coated in wet earth by the time they reached level ground again. The village began as a whisper. First a voice, faint, carried by the wind. Then a figure moving across water, thigh deep, dragging a door-turned raft. Then children, naked from the waist down, laughing as they chased a chicken through ankle-deep water. They had arrived. San Mateo was half drowned but not defeated. Dozens of homes stood tilted but standing. Smoke curled from makeshift stoves. A woman was washing clothes beside a bucket. An old man was mending a fishing net. Life, once again, had found a way. Rudy approached slowly, raising one hand. The boy followed, breathless. A man spotted them first. He stepped forward, cautious. "You're not from here." "No," Rudy said. "From Salog Norte. We came to check who's left and what you need." The man's face crumpled for a moment, not in sadness, but in relief. "You're the first to come." He shouted something, and others gathered. Within minutes, Rudy and the boy were surrounded by tired, wary faces, and something else. Hope. They were led to the community hall, a concrete structure with one wall missing. Inside, a woman handed them warm rice and dried fish. Another poured boiled water into mugs. A baby slept in the corner, wrapped in old clothes. "We didn't know if anyone would check," someone said. "We thought we were forgotten," said another. Rudy listened. Then he began to take names. He wrote each one in careful print. Families accounted for, children safe, elders needing medicine. He marked what food they had, how much clean water, what could be shared, what couldn't. The boy helped, reading names aloud. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind the ridge again. Still, Rudy wrote. When he finished, the man from before handed him a bamboo tube. For the walk back, he said. Water and prayers. Rudy nodded, but he didn't stand yet. He looked around the room once more, at the sleeping children, the bent-backed women washing, the men rebuilding fish traps with tired hands. He didn't say much, but his presence, like the boat before, was a quiet promise. You are not alone. When they finally turned to leave, the boy looked up at him. You think the mayor will send help soon? Yes, Rudy said simply, then added, but help already started. When you came for your Lola, when these people cooked for strangers, when someone saved rice instead of hiding it. The boy walked quietly beside him, and behind them, San Mateo, half drowned, half standing, watched the two figures walk back into the mud, toward the next village, toward another day. The sun hung low behind the trees, its fading warmth softening the edges of everything it touched. It was evening again, another long day folding into dusk, the kind of light that made everything seem quiet, as if the world too had grown tired. Rudy and the boy moved slower now. The way back felt heavier than the journey out. Muscles ached more, feet dragged, their legs caked with drying mud. But the rhythm remained steady. One step, one breath, then another. They said little. Sometimes the boy would ask a question, not out of curiosity, but as if trying to understand the way Rudy moved through the world. Did you always fish alone? Rudy didn't answer right away. Then softly, not always, but often. Weren't you scared? A pause. Only when I forgot to be grateful. The boy seemed to consider that. He didn't ask more. The trail narrowed as they approached the lower bend of the ridge. Trees leaned close again. Leaves rustled. A breeze moved through the brush like a whisper of some distant memory. Insects had returned. Cicadas hummed. Somewhere far off, a frog croaked. Life was reclaiming its place. And just as the path widened, they heard it. Voices, not far now. They rounded a bend and saw them. A search team, about 10 people carrying shovels, first aid kits, and stretchers made of bamboo. At the front, the mayor. He raised a hand, smiling. Rudy lifted his head, but didn't speak right away. Just nodded. The boy waved. The two groups met in the middle of the trail, among ferns and fallen branches. The mayor's smile faded as he saw Rudy's expression. Not despair, but the kind of fatigue that only comes after giving everything. We were coming to look for you. Rudy handed him the list. Names, numbers, ages. They're alive, hungry, tired, but alive. The mayor scanned the paper. San Mateo? Rudy nodded. I sent someone the long way around, the mayor said, but no one had returned. They'll need more rice and clean water. We're ready. For a while, they just stood there, the three of them surrounded by quiet. The boy leaned against a tree, sipping from the bamboo water tube. Rudy sat on a rock, rubbing his calves. Rest, the mayor said. Not yet, Rudy replied. You'll need someone who knows how to reach the eastern barangay. The roads are gone, but there's a stream that cuts behind the hills. I haven't been there in years, but I can show you the way. The mayor crouched beside him. You've done enough. Rudy looked at him, eyes clear, voice steady. They need to know they're not forgotten. The mayor didn't argue. Instead, he unrolled a map on the forest floor. Damp in places, ink smudged. He pointed. Here, Barangay Tinablayan, that's our next one. No word since the typhoon hit. Rudy studied it, traced the lines with a calloused finger. "We'll need to cross the river before dark. After that, the trail splits." The boy stood up. "I'll come." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "You've done more than most men twice your age." "I'm not tired," the boy said, then grinned. "Not enough." So it was decided. Another village, another trail. They moved again, Rudy, the boy, the mayor, and the others. Through brush and mud, their clothes still soaked, their shadows long on the earth. Not heroes, just people who refused to stop. Night fell again. The wind carried the smell of distant smoke. The team lit lanterns, tiny flames bobbing in the darkness, like stars moving across the ground. Somewhere ahead, more lives, more names, more waiting. And as Rudy pressed on, leaning on a bamboo stick carved just hours earlier, he felt the same thing he had felt in the river, during the storm. Not fear, not duty, but something quieter. A quiet refusal to turn away. A soft but unshakable yes. To life, to others, to the call that rises when everyone else falls back. Behind them, the search team whispered among themselves. "He's the one with the boat," someone said. "No," another answered. "He's the one who didn't stop." The night wrapped around them like a blanket, heavy, still, and warm in places where the wind didn't touch. Each step down the muddy slope made a different sound in the dark. Squelch, slip, breath. Squelch, slip, breath. The river was near again. This time, it was the Tinablayan crossing, a narrow stretch, but without a bridge. In the day, it might have been a mild challenge, but in the dark, with only the flicker of kerosene lanterns and the moon behind clouds, it became something else entirely. Rudy stood at the edge. The current wasn't strong, but the water was high, brown and swirling, uncertain beneath the surface. He took the lantern from the boy and waded in first. The others followed, one by one, ropes tied to each other's waists. It was slow. The water climbed to their chests in the middle. Someone slipped. The line held. They kept moving. On the far bank, they emerged soaked again, but safe. A moment of silence followed. The wind had picked up, not storming, just moving. It carried the scent of bananas, crushed leaves, and something faintly metallic. Old rain, wet soil. Rudy looked back once, watching the lanterns reflect off the river. The mayor stepped beside him. "You know this path?" "Parts of it," Rudy answered, and they walked again. Through narrow animal trails that twisted and curved, over roots and between boulders. The boy's feet were bare now. He carried the lantern high, his eyes constantly scanning the ground for snakes, holes, anything dangerous. Rudy noticed, but said nothing. The boy had grown in just a day. Then came the clearing. It appeared suddenly, as if the forest simply gave up, and a field took its place. At its center, a chapel, small, wooden, walls tilted from age and wind. A dog barked, then a voice. "Who's there?" The group paused. From the chapel door, an elderly woman appeared holding a candle. Behind her, silhouettes, children mostly. A man with a bandaged leg, a girl with a sleeping baby on her back. The woman peered at them, eyes sharp despite the dimness. "You're not from here." "We came from Salog Norte," Rudy said. "We're checking who made it through the typhoon." The woman said nothing, just opened the chapel door wider. The group stepped in and found more than they'd expected. 15 people, huddled on pews, blankets made from sacks, rice stored in a rusting tin barrel, a single flashlight, dead now. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and old prayer. The boy knelt by the baby. She's burning up. The mayor pulled out the medicine kit, gave what he could. They asked questions. Rudy took more names. Then the stories came. The water had risen too fast, they said. Homes gone in minutes. Some ran here. The chapel was the highest ground. Others were swept partway down the hill and had to claw their way back. No one had heard from the rest of the barangay. They feared half were still cut off behind the eastern ridge. Rudy's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that ridge, or had many years ago. "There's a back trail," he said quietly. "Runs behind the banana grove, connects to the east side." The woman shook her head. "That trail's gone. Landslide took it." Rudy didn't reply. He simply stood, walked outside, and stared east. Nothing was visible, just trees, black against deeper black. "I can try in the morning," he said. The mayor looked up. "You've already—" "I'm not finished." The boy stood too. "Me neither." And just like that, without a plan, without ceremony, the next step revealed itself. They would stay the night in the chapel. By lantern light, they cleaned the baby's skin with damp cloth, gave crackers to the children, shared sips of water, careful and slow. The mayor wrote a message to send back with 2 of his men, an update for Salog Norte. Supplies needed, people alive, others still missing. Then they lay down, side by side on the floorboards. The wind moved through the chapel walls like breath, and Rudy, staring at the wooden ceiling beams in the dark, thought of his boat. Still tied, hopefully, to the base of that dead tree, waiting in the muddy shore, maybe afloat, maybe gone. Didn't matter. He would walk if he had to. He would crawl, because now it wasn't just Salog Norte. It was all of them, all the forgotten places, all the names written in trembling handwriting. He closed his eyes. Somewhere, a rooster crowed. Too early for morning, but just late enough to believe it was coming. Dawn came quietly. It slipped into the chapel through the cracks in the wood, touching the edges of tired faces, warming the cool floorboards beneath curled feet. Outside, a faint mist clung to the grass, and birds began their cautious songs, the kind that stretch across foggy fields without ever feeling hurried. Rudy sat up before the others. His back ached, his arms were heavy, but his eyes were clear. He stepped outside and breathed deep. The air smelled of river silt and burned rice husk, with something faint and sweet drifting from unseen trees. The boy joined him, barefoot, rubbing his eyes. "Still want to try the ridge?" Rudy looked east. He didn't answer with words, just nodded once. They left the others behind, just for a while. The mayor had agreed to stay, to distribute what little aid they had, and wait for the second team from Salog Norte. Rudy and the boy walked toward the eastern edge of the field, where the land began to rise again, slowly, subtly, like the lifting of a heavy curtain. Banana trees marked the start of the old path, or what used to be a path. Now there was just slope, scattered debris, and the faintest imprint of where feet had once pressed into soft earth. "Still think this is it?" the boy asked. Rudy studied the land. He took a step, and then another. "This is it." The trail, or whatever was left of it, twisted around massive tree roots and the wreckage of a landslide. Fallen trunks lay like bones in the brush. Vines stretched across the way, like threads stitching shut an old wound. But Rudy remembered. He moved with the slow confidence of someone who had once known this path deeply, as a child maybe, or during fishing trips decades ago. He touched a boulder here, ducked under a branch there. Landmarks came back not as images, but as instincts. The boy followed close. never complaining. His small hands moved aside thorns before they reached Rudy. His eyes scanned for snakes, just like before. And when they reached the ridge's highest point, a narrow ledge with a view of the eastern basin, they stopped. Below lay the remains of another barangay. The roofs were splintered, fields flattened. Smoke still rose from somewhere near the edge, slow and gray, as if the fire had already lost its anger. But there were people, tiny figures, moving among debris, tending to others, hanging clothes. A woman carried 2 buckets on a bamboo pole. A child waved at something unseen. Rudy let out a breath. So they're alive. He looked at the boy, his voice gentler than before. I wasn't sure we'd see that. The boy smiled. We should go. But before they could begin the descent, they heard it. A low, distant rumble, the kind of sound that doesn't announce itself. It builds, rising slowly, like thunder learning how to speak. Then they saw the trees below begin to sway, not with wind, but something stronger. The earth beneath them shivered. Landslide, not near them. Farther to the east, behind the far side of the village. But still, enough to panic. From the ridge, they could see people scatter. Some ran toward a tall structure that looked like a half-collapsed school building. Others simply stood still. We have to move, Rudy said. They descended fast, using vines and roots to lower themselves. The path was steep and broken, and they slipped often. But gravity helped. Urgency helped more. By the time they reached the village edge, the air was thick with dust and panic. Someone shouted, "Another one's coming!" Rudy stepped forward, hands raised. There's high ground west, near the chapel. We came through that way. People turned to look. They didn't know him, just another stranger. But something in his voice made them listen. Rudy pointed. Follow the banana grove. The trail loops behind the ridge. It's safer. The boy added quickly. We'll show the way. Still, many hesitated. Then the woman with the buckets dropped them and stepped forward. I remember that path, she said. He's right. That was all it took. The group began to move, slowly at first, then faster. Rudy led them westward, past the broken fields, through the grove, back toward the chapel. Not everyone could walk. Some carried others. Children wept. Old men leaned on bamboo poles. But they moved, because one voice had broken through the fear. By mid-morning, they reached the ridge again. And when they crested it, and the chapel came into view below, that small, tilting structure surrounded by waving palms, a sound rose from the group. Not cheering, just a long exhale. Relief. The mayor was already outside, arms crossed, watching them appear one by one. He didn't ask how Rudy had done it. He just nodded. And once more, as the group trickled into the chapel yard, Rudy pulled out his notebook. More names, more lives accounted for. And as he wrote, the boy stood beside him, wiping his hands on his shirt. How many now? He asked. Rudy flipped the pages. 67. The boy blinked. You've saved 67 people. Rudy looked down at the list. No, he said. We reached them. That's all. The boy didn't press the point, but in his heart, he knew what he'd seen and what kind of man he'd chosen to follow. The day wore on, heavy and long, but not without purpose. They cleared the chapel yard first, made space for the new arrivals. Blankets laid on gravel, bamboo mats borrowed from nearby homes. The mayor assigned tasks. The stronger ones gathered firewood. The women, those who could still walk without pain, began preparing rice with borrowed pots. Children chased each other between banana trees, laughing in a way only children could. as if disaster had never touched their door. And Rudy, he kept writing. By mid-afternoon, the list had grown past 70 names, each one scribbled in his small notebook, ink sometimes smudged from his damp fingers. He rewrote names twice, 3 times if they were hard to spell. He made sure no one was left off. Each name felt like a thread pulling them all together, not just as survivors, but as part of something unspoken. Something stitched out of kindness and the refusal to turn away. Later, a messenger arrived. He was thin and breathless, with a letter tucked in a plastic bag tied around his neck. From Salog Norte. Rudy read it silently. Relief efforts were on the way. The water had receded enough for a larger boat to pass the southern bend. Supplies would arrive within 2 days: food, medicine, clothing, volunteers too. He handed the note to the mayor. "We're not alone in this anymore," Rudy said. The mayor nodded. "But we still have tonight." Rudy looked out across the chapel yard. Fires were already lit, rice boiling, laughter rising again, timid but real. He saw the boy helping a limping man to a shaded spot, saw an old woman combing her granddaughter's hair with a carved wooden brush. He smiled softly. But there was one more thing to do. He asked around quietly, about a place, barely remembered, where another small cluster of homes might have stood, farther inland, past the coconut groves, near the rock wall shaped like a sleeping man. Most people said it was gone, too far, too risky. But one woman holding her newborn tight spoke up. "My brother lived there," she whispered. "If there's even a chance." Rudy didn't wait. He gathered a small group, the boy, one of the younger men, and a girl who said she'd been there before, years ago. They set off just before dusk. The path was thick with brush, unused, but the girl knew how to navigate it. She pointed out where to step. Warned of ants and sharp leaves, the way narrowed into a foot trail, then widened again near a grove of mango trees. At the base of the sleeping man rock wall, they found what was left. 3 houses, or rather, their bones. Roofs peeled back, posts leaning, but signs of life too. Smoke from a cook fire barely burning, a pot still warm. And then a voice, low, hoarse. An elderly man stepped out from behind a broken door. He held a long stick, like a staff, and blinked into the failing light. "Who are you?" Rudy stepped forward. "Friends?" From the other houses, more faces emerged. Children, quiet and wide-eyed, a woman carrying 2 chickens, a young man with a bandaged head and dried blood on his shirt. 8 more. 8 people who had no reason to expect anyone. Rudy didn't speak right away. He just stood there, letting the silence settle like dust. Then he said, "We have food, water, a place to rest." The old man looked down at his stick, then back at Rudy. He nodded. They returned by lantern light. This time the journey felt different, not heavier, though they were tired, but fuller. The road behind them was one of return, not escape. Each step back was a step toward the others. When they arrived, the chapel yard erupted in murmurs. Some ran to embrace long-lost friends. Others bowed their heads in quiet prayer. Rudy helped the old man sit beneath the largest tree. The boy passed out water and rice, and someone began to sing, softly at first. A lullaby, maybe, or a folk song. The words floated between firelight and stars. Rudy leaned against the chapel wall. He didn't sing, just listened. The night, for the first time in days, was not just a waiting place between storms. It was shelter. It was earned. He watched the boy hand the last bowl of food to a woman with blisters on her hands. "Eat," the boy said. "You're safe now." Rudy closed his eyes, just for a moment, and felt, at last, the weight shift, not away, but into something solid, something shared. The kind of weight that didn't drag you down, but told you that you were still standing. Rain returned during the night. Not a storm, not the kind that howls and scatters everything in its path, but a quiet, steady drizzle. It tapped gently against the chapel's tin roof, a lullaby for the exhausted. Inside, families slept in clusters. Mothers curled around their children. The elderly rested with hands folded on their chests. The fires outside had dimmed to embers, and the boy kept them glowing, feeding bits of wood now and then. Careful not to wake anyone. Rudy didn't sleep much. He sat on the steps of the chapel, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. The rain cooled his skin. His notebook sat open beside him, protected under a folded tarp. His pen hovered above a name, the old man they'd found near the rock wall. "Victor," the man had said. "Victor Royo." Rudy wrote it carefully, each letter deliberate. He didn't know why it mattered so much, just that it did. Each name meant someone had made it. Someone was seen, remembered, counted. It was more than record-keeping. It was a quiet act of defiance, against silence, against forgetting. As dawn broke, golden light began to stretch across the sky, and with it came the distant drone of an engine. Faint, then closer, then unmistakable. The boy sat up from where he had dozed near the coals. "That's a boat." Rudy stood. Others began stirring, heads lifted, eyes blinked toward the river's bend. And then they saw it. A larger boat, gray and sturdy, rounded the curve where mangroves arched overhead. A blue tarp flapped above its deck. Two men stood at the front, waving. It was the relief team. Shouts rang out. Not wild cheers, but surprised, relieved laughter. People clapped. Some cried. Rudy walked slowly to the riverbank, the boy at his side. As the boat docked, a young woman in a vest marked Responder stepped down, carrying a clipboard and 2 bags of supplies. Behind her, others unloaded crates of water, dried fish, first aid kits. The mayor stepped forward. "Welcome," he said. The woman looked around, clearly overwhelmed by the sight. So many people still gathered, still alive. "We didn't think anyone made it out here," she admitted. "You're far off the main route. We came because someone sent a note." She pulled a crumpled, plastic-wrapped letter from her pocket. Rudy didn't need to read it. He recognized his own handwriting. The boy grinned. They found it. And just like that, a new rhythm began. The responders distributed medicine and food. They examined wounds, treated fevers, bandaged sprains. The stronger villagers helped unload supplies. A temporary communication post was set up near the chapel steps. Messages were relayed. Family names were checked against missing person lists. The chapel became more than shelter. It became a hub, a place of connection. By noon, another boat was already en route. One of the responders approached Rudy. "You the one who wrote this?" He nodded. She looked him over, as if trying to match the quiet man before her with the desperate scrawl of ink from that letter. "We're going to need your help. You've mapped the people. You know where they came from." Rudy looked down at his notebook, pages now filled with names. "Of course," she smiled. "You're not with any group, are you? Red Cross? Coast Guard?" "No," he said. "Just a fisherman." She raised an eyebrow. "Not today, you're not." Later that day, Rudy stood with the mayor and 2 responders, marking locations on a laminated map with a red pen. Landslide zones, passable trails, missing clusters. Every dot held meaning now. Not just geography, but people. He didn't talk much, just pointed, marked, described what the terrain felt like underfoot, where the water might still run high. "You know this place like your own skin," one of them said. Rudy didn't respond. He just kept working. As the sun began to dip once more behind the trees, he found himself back by the river's edge, watching the current slide past. The boy came and sat beside him. "They'll be okay now," the boy said, "even if we leave." Rudy nodded, but he didn't stand up. Not yet. The river had changed. Its banks were wider, its color darker, but it still moved, unbothered, unwavering, much like the man beside it. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph, worn at the edges. The boy peered over. "Your family?" Rudy stared at it for a long while, then nodded. "My wife, my daughter. Lost them years ago. Another storm." The boy didn't speak. Rudy folded the photo carefully and returned it to his pocket. "They were the reason I started fishing again, to stay afloat." He smiled just a little. "And now, this." The boy looked out over the water. "We can go back tomorrow." "To the sea?" Rudy asked. The boy shook his head. "Number to the others. The ones we didn't reach." Rudy raised an eyebrow. "There's still more?" "There's always more," the boy said. The words lingered between them, and then Rudy nodded. Not quickly, but with the certainty of a man who understood that even when the storm passes, the calling does not. The chapel, once a sanctuary from the storm, had become something more. By morning it was humming with life and the soft order of restoration. Children swept the chapel floor with coconut brooms. A responder taught 2 women how to clean wounds using boiled water and betadine. The elderly, once silent with fatigue, now chatted in low tones, voices recovering their cadence. A few men patched up bamboo walls using salvaged strips of nipa leaves and rope. Rudy sat beneath the same mango tree as before, notebook balanced on his knee, but now he was joined by others. They had started calling him Tata Rudy, a name that softened in their mouths, part affection, part respect. He didn't correct them. The boy sat nearby, whittling a stick with a dull pocket knife. He was humming something tuneless, but steady. The same rhythm he used while bailing water from the boat, while running through the rain, while lifting strangers into safety. His presence had become so natural, so woven into the days, that few even asked his name anymore. He was simply there, constant, reliable, like breath. One of the responders approached with a folded map. "We're organizing an outbound crew tomorrow," she said. "Small boats, just to check on the clusters farther up the inland path. See if anyone's left behind." She looked at Rudy. "You up for one more trip?" Rudy didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of the notebook. The chapel compound was safe now. No one was hungry. The wounded were healing. Names had been written. But still, "There's always more," he said quietly. The woman smiled. "That's what I hoped you'd say." That afternoon, Rudy prepared the boat. He used the one he'd carved himself, the smaller of the 2 that had survived the typhoon. Its sides had been reinforced with rope and split bamboo. The outriggers were repaired with salvaged wood. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. The boy helped pack the supplies: rice, salt, water, bandages, a flashlight, and a flare gun. One responder volunteered to join. Her name was Clarice, quiet-eyed and steady-handed. She had grown up in the coastal town of Tabagon, and her calm, collected way reminded Rudy of women from his own childhood. They set off just before dusk. The river greeted them with silence. No more rain. just the hush of water moving beneath hull and paddle. The boy sat at the front, eyes sharp. Clarice kept notes as Rudy pointed out old markers: a tree split by lightning, a broken footbridge, the ruins of a schoolhouse swallowed by vines. Hours passed. They found the first cluster at a clearing marked by 2 leaning mango trees. 4 people, a mother, her teenage daughter, and 2 elderly neighbors, all weak from days without food. Their stories were the same: trapped, waiting, unsure if anyone would ever come. They stared at Rudy as if he'd emerged from legend. "We heard nothing," the mother whispered. "Only wind, then silence." Clarice helped distribute food. The boy gave the old man his own shirt. Rudy walked through their ruined shelters, quietly counting what could be salvaged, what had to be left behind. "Will we go with you now?" the girl asked. Rudy nodded. But not tonight. He would return, just as he had before. By the time they turned back, the moon had risen, slicing silver across the river. The boy fell asleep against the boat's edge, mouth open slightly, one hand still resting near the paddle. Clarice sat near Rudy, watching the water ripple around them. "You've done more than most," she said softly. "More than any of us expected from someone with only a wooden boat." Rudy didn't respond for a long time. Then he said, "It wasn't just the boat." She waited. It was the people who climbed in. They didn't speak after that. The rest of the ride passed in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full, the kind that carried weight, meaning, the kind that didn't need to be filled. When they returned to the chapel, it was nearly dawn. The fires had dimmed again. The wind was calm. A rooster crowed somewhere in the trees. The others were still sleeping. Rudy stepped off the boat, legs stiff but sure. The boy stirred, rubbing his eyes. "We're back?" Rudy smiled. "For now." The chapel door creaked open. A small girl stood there, holding a steaming mug in both hands. "For you," she said. The mug was cracked. The liquid inside smelled of ginger and rice, salabat warm and sharp. Rudy took it carefully. "Thank you." He sat on the chapel step and drank slowly, letting the heat fill his chest. From the trees, morning light filtered down, quiet and gold, and Rudy, for the first time in many days, let his shoulders fall. Not in defeat, but in rest. Because for this moment, for this breath, there was nothing more to chase, nothing more to carry. Only the stillness of a man who had gone out into the storm and come back. Not whole, perhaps, but real and present. The days after the river journey unfolded like a quiet tide. Steady, deliberate, filled with small returns. Word of the rescue effort began to ripple outward. Radios crackled with names. Relief boats arrived more regularly now, bringing rice, sardines, antibiotics, and solar lamps. Volunteers came with notepads and cameras. Government officials stepped briefly onto muddy ground, nodded at clipboards, and promised rebuilding. But even as structure returned, something else remained. Something fragile and human, stitched together not by policy, but by memory. Each morning, Rudy still rose before first light. He walked the chapel grounds barefoot, feeling the earth's breath beneath his soles. He helped cook porridge over an open flame. He refilled water jugs from the catchment. He sat with the wounded, not to treat them, but to listen. Clarice often joined him, her presence gentle. Together they reviewed supply lists, sketched safe zones on maps, and noted who still hadn't been found. But more often, they simply observed. The way people reclaimed their routines. The way children played with sticks and banana leaves, laughing again. The way songs returned, soft hymns at dusk, a mother humming while she braided her daughter's hair. On the third day, a Coast Guard captain approached Rudy with a formal request. "We'd like you to speak at the memorial," he said, "for those who didn't survive." Rudy looked away. He had never liked stages or microphones or the sound of his own voice amplified, but he agreed. That afternoon, they walked to a hill overlooking the town's center. The wind was strong but kind. A temporary altar had been built. Coconut trunks lashed together, with white cloths tied at each corner. Dozens gathered. Some stood barefoot. Some wore clean shirts for the first time in weeks. Names were read aloud. Children released paper lanterns into the sky, and then they called Rudy forward. He stood before the crowd, heart thudding beneath his ribs. He didn't read a speech. He hadn't written one. He just told the truth. He spoke of the first families he'd found, of the silence between the trees, of the boy with no name who had refused to leave his side, of the fire that refused to die even as the wind screamed. "I didn't come to be a hero," he said, his voice low. "I came because the water was rising, and I couldn't sit still." He paused, letting that settle. "We all come from storms, some bigger than others, but it's what we do after the rain that tells the real story." Silence followed, and then a quiet ripple of applause, not loud, but full of weight. Later that evening, as Rudy walked back to the riverbank, he found the boy sitting on the edge of the dock, feet dangling in the water. "I heard them call you a hero," the boy said. Rudy chuckled. "Is that what they're saying now?" The boy nodded. "Do you think you are?" Rudy didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the surface. 1, 2, 3 skips, then gone. He watched the ripples spread, soft and steady. "I think I did what needed doing," he said finally. The boy nodded, thoughtful. Rudy turned. "And you? What will you do now?" The boy looked up. "Stay, if that's okay." Rudy smiled, not in approval, but in recognition, the quiet understanding between two people who'd passed through the same fire. "Then we begin again tomorrow," he said. That night, under a moon both silver and forgiving, Rudy opened his notebook one last time. He flipped past the names, past the maps, past the lists, and on a fresh page he wrote, "Not everything lost is gone." He closed the book, let the ink dry, and finally, for the first time in weeks, he let himself sleep without waking at every sound, because now, others would carry the watch. The seasons began to shift. Rain still came, as it always would in this corner of the world, but the kind that whispered instead of howled. Mango trees bore new fruit. The chapel walls were rebuilt with sturdier beams and corrugated iron. A garden appeared in the clearing beside it, planted by the children who once took shelter beneath its eaves. They grew cassava, eggplant, sweet potato, the things their parents had once grown, before the storm turned everything upside down. And Rudy stayed. He didn't return to the life he had before. Not to the daily tides of fishing alone, not to the quiet routines of counting days by the size of his catch. Something in him had been rearranged. He still took the boat out now and then, sometimes with Clarice, sometimes with the boy, who now had a name that everyone knew, Elias. But the trips were different. They weren't rescues anymore. They were deliveries, check-ins, connections, sometimes just a slow drift down the river, to show presence, to remind the farther clusters that they hadn't been forgotten. He had become, in a way, a keeper of memory, not by telling stories, but by living in their echo. One morning, he visited the site of the first pickup, the place where the mother had stood knee-deep in floodwater, waving with a rag, shouting into the wind. It looked different now. No flood, no wreckage, just a stump with new leaves and footprints in the drying mud. A girl was playing there, her mother's daughter perhaps. She looked up when she saw Rudy. "You're the man with the boat," she said. He nodded. "I remember." She smiled and returned to her game, tracing circles with a stick, drawing suns and stars in the dirt. That evening, Clarice joined him by the chapel steps. She handed him a small parcel wrapped in banana leaf. "What's this?" Rudy asked. "A thank you, from one of the mothers. She said she never knew how to tell you in words." He opened the parcel. Inside was a carved pendant, shaped like a boat, with 8 tiny notches along the side. 8 for the 8 families. He closed his hand around it. The fire crackled nearby. The air smelled of earth, wood smoke, and salt. Clarice looked out across the field. "Do you think people will remember this story?" Rudy thought about it, about the wind, the swollen river, the hundreds of hands reaching out from darkness, not just to be saved, but to hold on. "Maybe," he said softly, "or maybe they'll remember something else. A boat, a name on a wall, a voice that came through the storm." He paused. "But even if they forget the details, they'll still know what courage feels like." Clarice didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some truths don't require confirmation. They just exist, like current beneath still water. That night, Rudy walked alone by the river. The moonlight shimmered on the surface. He could see reflections, not just of trees and stars, but of all the people he'd carried. Their faces, their hands, their voices calling in the dark. He whispered a few of their names, letting the sound float out into the open, not to summon them, not to mourn, but to honor. Because when all the roads are washed away and the sky has split itself open and every structure has fallen, what's left is the name you carry, the name you answer to in the storm, the name others will whisper when they need to believe someone will come. And in that name, Rudy had given them something more lasting than rescue. He'd given them memory and hope. The story of Rudy wasn't broadcast on global news. There were no medals, no viral clips, no monument carved in his likeness. But in the eyes of those he saved, in the quiet, flickering moments when breath returned, when fear ebbed, he became more than a fisherman with a wooden boat. He became a keeper of life, a bridge between despair and safety, a soul who chose to row toward the cries rather than away. Heroism doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it slips down flooded paths, carrying rice in a burlap sack. Sometimes it steers a patched-up boat toward the unknown, trusting that the strength of a human heart will be enough. And sometimes it leaves no footprints at all, only the memory of hands that lifted you, and the warmth of someone who didn't ask if it was safe, only if it was right. In the end, Rudy's story is not just one of survival, it's a reminder that even in the fiercest storm, there are people who will come, people who remember your name, people who row into the night with nothing but courage and never stop paddling until you're home. Thank you for joining me tonight. Wherever you are, may you rest knowing that somewhere in the world, someone like Rudy still rows, still listens, still shows up, even when the wind howls, especially then.